Good morning, and welcome to our panel discussion, Minding the Gap, Cultivating the Next Generation of Diverse Agricultural and Environmental Justice Activists. I'm Evelyn Cooper, Assistant Dean and Director for Retention, Diversity, and Special Initiatives at the University of Maryland College of Agriculture and Natural Resources. For over 25 years, I've been involved with working with high school students and college students to engage them in careers and preparing for careers in the environment and in agriculture. So today's topic is near and dear to my heart, and I want to thank you all for joining us. So I want to begin by just giving you some background to our topic, and then I will introduce you to our panelists. But at any time during our session, please feel free to drop a question into the chat. We have people fielding those questions, and we will be sure to ask them of our panelists. So environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. Agricultural and food justice movements are a part of the environmental justice movement, and it focuses on ensuring equitable benefits and risks of how food is grown, processed, transported, distributed, and consumed. According to a 2020 article in Diverse Issues in Higher Education, African Americans composed 13% of the US population. However, they only received 2.8% of the nation's total environmental and agricultural degrees in science in 2019, making these areas of study the least diverse of all scientific areas. So this stereotype that Black people just aren't interested in the environment or in agricultural issues seems to persist among the general public. A 2018 study conducted by the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences found that both whites and non-whites underestimated the environmental concerns held by minorities and associated the term environmentalist with a white face. Yet the irony is that despite being perceived as environmentally concerned, all minority groups surveyed, African Americans, Latinx, Asians, and Native Americans, self-reported higher environmental concern than white people who were surveyed in the same study. And despite the white image associated with American environmentalism, the most pro-environmental voting bloc in the US is the Congressional Black Caucus, the Congressional Black Caucus. So the question that we pose here today is, how do we inspire the next generation of scientists, activists, advocates to tackle issues such as food access, environmental degradation, climate change, while increasing activism and advocacy within communities of color? So today we are joined by three experts who engage and empower young people in various ways to develop knowledge and skills necessary to address such grand challenges as protecting the environment, improving food systems, and advocating for communities of color. Today, I am pleased to introduce our panelists. First, and I'm going to ask you guys to wave when I call your name, Mr. Che Axum. Che is the director of the Center of Urban Agriculture and Gardening Education in the College of Agriculture, Urban Sustainability, and Environmental Sciences at the University of District of Columbia. Dr. Nia Imani Fields. Dr. Fields is the State of Maryland 4-H Program Leader and Assistant Director of the University of Maryland Extension. Dr. Candice Duncan. Dr. Duncan is an instructor and soil chemist at the University of Maryland Department of Environmental Science and Technology in the College of Agriculture and Natural Resources at the University of Maryland. Thank you all for joining us today. So you notice I gave everyone a very short introduction, and that's because I want you all to take some time to share about your background. So the first question is, tell our audience about your background and initiatives that help you to inspire and prepare youth from underrepresented backgrounds to become that next generation who pursues science and advocacy and activism within the agricultural and environmental fields. And we'll start with Jay.
Yes, well, good morning, and thank you for having me. And it's so good to see all these University of Maryland folks there. And so, but yeah, my background and interest in agriculture comes from a different direction. I was originally wanted to be a pharmacist, and I had the opportunity to work in pharmacies. And boy, I just saw some things that I just wasn't really comfortable with, and just medication. At the same time, I was getting into the health fields and things like that. So I happened upon a job at the USDA, in which I worked ARS, Agricultural Research Service. I worked there for over 20 years before I went and taught middle school. And then I went back to school to get my degree in agronomy. It was called agronomy, and I think they changed the name of the college now. But I was just very fortunate. I had some very good teachers, science teachers there. I had Dr. Bruce James, my soil chemistry guy. I had Dr. Ray Weil. I mean, they just inspired me tremendously. And also at the same time, I started farming. So all those kind of things kind of came together for me. But I'm from the city. I'm from Northeast Washington, D.C. I am not supposed to be an agronomist, if that means anything. So, but the first place I go dealing with young folks immediately, I go to Dr. George Washington Carver. I mean, I go straight to him as far as trying to inspire young people, especially young African Americans and people like that, to pursue this field of agriculture and agricultural research. Because for so long, I mean, like you say, there was such a bad connotation of agriculture among Black folks. It's just they disassociated it much with slavery. But I had to explain to them that's not true. I mean, I'm writing a book now about the early origins of urban agriculture, Nile Valley civilizations. But I mean, the first true sustainable civilization was in ancient Egypt, Nile Valley. These were Black people. So that's where I go. I go there immediately and just give those kind of facts and talk to them about that and just give them information that they just don't know.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Okay, Dr. Nehemiah Fields.
Good morning. So like Jay, I am not supposed to be working in the field of agriculture. I'm originally from New York. I've been living in Baltimore for about 20 years now. But my background is in youth development. I come from the lens of inspiring young people, exposing them to new opportunities and careers in agriculture, in STEM, in the arts, and doing that through the University of Maryland 4-H program. So I have a background in urban educational leadership and public policy, and I bring that lens to this space. We have faculty across the state who work with our 4-H program to prepare youth for college careers and beyond, to expose them to new programs, hands-on learning, getting their hands in the soil, understanding their environment around them and what opportunities they have. My particular research focus, though, centers around social justice, youth development. So, really thinking critically, having youth be able to think critically and understanding the root causes of issues. So not just that food insecurity exists, but which communities are impacted and why, right? Why are zip codes a determining factor for air quality and water quality? And then what's their role and responsibility in addressing those types of issues, caring about the world around them and feeling that sense of stewardship. So we have lots of programs and curriculums in 4-H that encourage deeper learning and understanding of issues and particularly around agriculture and environmental education and sciences, and then preparing them to be advocates for their communities and for our state and our country. So that's the lens that I bring to this work.
Thank you. Dr. Duncan.
First, I'd like to say thank you for the invitation to join the panel and be a part of Taking Nature Black. So a little bit about my background. I too was not supposed to be an environmental scientist. My thought was that I was going to be a physician. So I majored in biology. And at the end of that degree decided, no, I don't think this is quite what I want to do. And the pivotal point for me was the opportunity to intern at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency right after I graduated. And I had the opportunity to work with actually one of the founding a researcher scientist in one of the National Health Environmental Effects Research Division, Dr. Stephen Nesno, back in 1970 when EPA was started. At the time, I did not know that that's what he did, but I was able to work with him, and that sparked my love for environmental science. So I'm not so much an agriculture person, but everything that I do is essentially tied back to agriculture in some way, shape, or form, the research that I do. So how do I inspire the youth today? My biggest motivator right now is exposure. Nia talked a little bit about it, and that's exposing students at the earliest age possible to show them that if you have this spark of interest in this field, this is where you could be. This is what you could do. These are the avenues and the ways that you can get there. And more so at the high school level, because we're not seeing a lot of environmental science interests per se coming out of high school, some here and there. And so what a program that I've been working on is trying to get those high schoolers that spark interested, and then we can kind of reel them into the environmental science, natural sciences, agricultural fields, and then they can spread their wings from there.
Excellent. So 3 totally different paths to your current career areas. So very interesting. So Amnesty International recently had a survey that suggested that Generation Z, those ages 6 to 24, more so than prior generations, have been more affected and more upset by environmental injustices that impact the fundamental rights to clean air, water, land, and food. Why do you think that these issues are important and resonating so much with young people now?
Well,
Go
go ahead. No, you go ahead. Go ahead.
So youth and young adults have always been at the center of social justice work, right? So that's not anything new. And I think youth have some unique strengths that we begin to lose as adults. And some of that is hope, right? Belief that the world can be better than it is. We as adults just tend to be tainted by the worlds we've lived in, the experiences we've had, and an inability to dream bigger than the realities that we're currently in. So youth and adults and young adults have always been at the forefront of justice and civil rights movements. And they tend to have less patience in waiting, right? They want to see change and they want to see it now. And we can't knock them for that. We often wait too long and take too little steps in moving towards social justice in agriculture and environmental science and education and healthcare. The list goes on and on. I think this past year, the conversations around social justice began to be amplified and that was at the forefront of folks' minds, particularly those that didn't have to think about that before because they might not have personally been impacted by injustices. But I think it's been illuminated to see that the injustice of one person affects others. And Dr. King said it best, where injustice anywhere or to anywhere, it's injustice everywhere, and thinking about the world more globally in that way is important. So I hope that we emerge from this moment in history having learned something about our systems, whether it's our environmental systems, our healthcare systems, the economy, access to food, and just seeing how the halt of in-person schooling can impact whether children eat. I mean, those things are important for us to think about and reckon with. We have curriculum in 4-H that allows folks to understand cultures and the differences between people and how to be advocates, right? So we as professionals might not be advocating in every way that we might think of advocacy, but we certainly should be able to provide youth with the tools so they have that agency, they have the networks, they have the relationships to begin to advocate for themselves and for their communities.
Thank you. Che, you want to add to that?
Well, I think, the synchronicity and the serendipity of this time, I guess 50 years ago, there was a war. There was a war in Vietnam. You had a lot of young people who were very active. Well, we don't have a war. We have some different wars now. We have a war, the environmental war, the war that we're dealing with that, environmental issues. And then we've just had this pandemic, which has really added to that. And plus the racial injustices. So these things right now, all these things that young people are really gravitating toward. And I think every young generation finds something to really rally toward and combine their efforts on to try to solve. So I think it's just a sign of the time. But you know, the environmental aspect of it and the pandemic, you know, these are these kind of science related things that are happening to us. And so this is going to definitely draw more young folks into science. And, you know, you're going to have to have science to solve these problems. You can't, these are not just economic problems. These are not just political problems. You're going to have science to solve those two problems. So those two things, and plus the racial inequality thing, is probably will be the three biggest things that young people in their lifetime will try to tackle. And I'm sure they will.
Thank you. Candice?
Yes, so in thinking about this question, I kind of feel as though this Gen Z group is kind of actually physically seeing the effects of some of these environmental issues that we're having. So when you have a hurricane like Katrina come and wipe out a whole part of Louisiana, they can physically see that and see the effects of it happen real time. Just here in the state of Maryland, Ellicott City was literally historic. Ellicott City was washing down the road, right? So I think part of their drive and their passion behind some of these environmental issues is because they are physically seeing them or present in those spaces when it's happening, and they're seeing these long-term effects of it. And it's compelling them to say, it's not just something that a professor or an educator is telling you about. Oh, we had this event happen. They are seeing these tsunamis happen. They're seeing these mudslides happen. They're seeing, you know, islands and parts of countries being washed away. And I think that's what's driving them to want to be a part of environmental work and jump into these environmental sciences and say, what can we do? We're seeing it. What can we do? We need to do something now.
I think those are all three excellent perspectives. And I can really relate to that last point about young people seeing the impacts now, because I think about 25, 30 years ago when I was studying earth science and we, you know, read our textbooks and we watched videos and we listened to lectures, but the things that are happening today weren't happening in real time back then. So while I was excited about it, I think that urgency didn't exist because we weren't quite seeing the impacts of climate change and the things that we studied back. So excellent answers. So in my opening, I mentioned a report that environmental and ag studies are among the least diverse fields of study in STEM. What do you all think are some barriers to underrepresented youth when it comes to being involved and pursuing these STEM-oriented career fields? We'll start with Nia.
Sure. So Shay mentioned this earlier, that there's a stigma and misunderstanding around the agricultural fields, particularly for Black and Brown people. There's deep stories and relationships that connect directly to racism and slavery and immigration, right? All of those things that impact folks perhaps wanting to stay clear from those career fields because they don't see it as progress. And it's important to elevate the agricultural and environmental fields as respected fields. They're essential to our basic human needs. We all need food, we all need air, we all need water, we all need a planet that will sustain itself. So, you know, it's a career that needs to be respected and better understood and elevated. I think the misunderstanding or perhaps opportunity that exists is folks don't understand how diverse the careers can be in agriculture and in environmental education and sciences. So we need scientists, we need engineers, activists, farmers, chefs, educators. All of these things can be found in these careers. And we probably need to do a better job at communicating the diversity in these career fields so that folks see themselves represented. And back to that representation piece, they need to see more people that look like us so they feel like this is a space where they also belong and deserve to be.
Thank you. Candice?
So I think Nia kind of hit the nail on the head with what I was thinking about, some of those barriers. When I think about students being exposed to agriculture, natural resources, and environmental science, they get it at a very young age, just in their daily interactions, taking walks, going to the parks, doing things like that. So the exposure to a degree is there. But at some point, there is, like you mentioned, a barrier. And in doing some research and for some programming that I was trying to get funded, what we found is that in some instances, one, representation, they don't see people that look like them in the field that they want to pursue. And second, there's a term of this chilly climate that they experience when they do try to pursue those types of fields, right? So we have to somehow change that perception that they have. If that spark of interest is there, and then they get to that place, that class, that experience, that internship, and they have this chilly climate, like, you sure this is what you want to do? Are you sure this is the field you want to go into? That's discouraging. And they go the opposite direction and say, well, I'll do something else. That is where we kind of have that impasse, that barrier that you mentioned, that can kind of prevent them from moving forward into that next phase of saying agronomy is what I want to do, or agriculture is what I want to do, or environmental science is what I want to do. So I think that's one of those barriers. Not, us exposing them to the fields and what they can do is one way we can help get them there. But then we have to open that door to make sure that there are those no chilly climate barriers. So.
Absolutely. Thank you. Che?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I worked at the USDA ARS for 20 years. I started there in '85, and I left in probably 2008, somewhere around that time. But I don't know why I got there. Out of about 600 scientists there were probably only 4 African-American scientists there. And those 4 caught holy hell. So I think if that bringing that thermometer is really down now, raising that thermometer so people can be comfortable to work there without any barriers, psychological barriers while they are there, will really help, get more people into science. Because, like I tell young people all the time, agriculture is the mother of all sciences. Every science is in agriculture. Every science is in agriculture. So there's so many things, but like I said, we just said that there's just not that many opportunities for young folks to really know the broad range of career opportunities, and that's where the USDA needs to really come in and just put their foot down and say, you know what, we're going to get more people of color in here as far as researchers and things like that. That has to be done, but it's going to be a challenge because young African American person going to work in North Dakota or South Dakota, it's going to be a challenge. But they can withstand some of those pressures. It can be done.
Evelyn, can I share? Shay mentioning his career experience with USDA just reminded me of something, that the field of agriculture has been politicized. And I think that's part of the problem, is that folks associated with one political party or one political way of thinking that might not be welcoming to people who look like us, right? So me working in extension as an example, I have been in Shay's shoes where I've been one and only that looks like me, and speaking to an audience and trying to inspire them to be more welcoming for folks who look like me, because, and trying to move away from this, we need to teach urban communities about where their food comes from, or we need to teach folks about how their food is grown, versus trying to understand the cultures between the two and how we are all interconnected in so many ways. So I think we have to get past some of those realities and barriers that exist within the space and the culture of agriculture.
Absolutely. I always say that the greatest problem that agriculture has in terms of attracting students of color is really a branding problem. When students of color typically think about agriculture, they are connecting this to a history, a negative history in this country of ag being in the fields, and then their parents also and their families play a role in that. Because they want to send their students off to college to be successful and to be able to take care of themselves. And they don't really think of ag or environmental careers as that type of career. You go to college, you come out and you get a degree where you're making good money. Although there are really good paying jobs, we just don't think that way about it. So we've not branded ourselves in that way to encourage students to pursue, and for families to be supportive of that, because we know that in underrepresented students, families play a large role in what they pursue in college. Will you be a science major, or will you be a business major? Those are conversations that are happening with families. So in the chat, I have a question that's relevant to what we're talking about from Ari, who asked the question, many schools do not have environmental science classes for students in Baltimore City. Only 2 teachers are environmental science teachers. What suggestions do you have for increasing awareness of environmental science as a career? So does anyone want to tackle that question?
I'll take that one.
Okay. Candice?
So that is something that we do see quite often, that high school curriculums don't necessarily have environmental science as an option. And so I think that's part of the university's job, is to help in any way possible those who are in environmental science to help build that curriculum at high schools as best as we can. And it could be something as simple as providing some resources just for the exposure of all the different topics that fall under environmental science. Or it could just be providing some hands-on experiences, as Mia mentioned previously in one of her comments. We know that hands-on experience will capture the interest. And once, as I said before, once they catch the bug, or if that light bulb is hit, that spark is lit, then it's full steam ahead. So it's just a matter of having access to those people who are doing environmental science work and making that connection and asking for that help. Because I've had people ask me in the past about certain topics under environmental science. And then, you also have these federal agencies. That's what their job is. They actually have programming coordinators at the agencies that foster these relationships with local high schools, where they can bring them to their campus and do tours to expose the students to the careers there. So there are quite a few ways to bridge that connection. And I'd be more than happy to speak with you if you have any additional questions.
Thank you. And I'd also, Nia, did you want to ask that? I see you.
Yeah, I was just going to add, reaching out to organizations like the Maryland Ag Education Foundation, Maryland 4-H, we have curriculum, and MAFE in particular engages in different advocacy efforts and pulls together folks who are like-minded to advocate for changes in curriculum. But then, like Candice mentioned, sometimes K-12 can be more rigid as far as what they can and cannot do in the classroom, but they are expanding this notion of experiential learning. So they're looking for partners to add to their curriculum. And we have that, and we have been trying to pair our curriculum with the standards of the schools so that it's more palatable and more appealing to teachers and administrators in the school systems.
I would like to add also reaching out to other organizations. Nia represents 4-H, but then there's also Manners, Minorities in Agriculture and Natural Resources and Related Sciences. There are chapters all over the US and internationally. They work with high schools, junior high schools, to provide programming and resources to expose students to STEM careers related to ag, natural resources, and the environment. So start connecting with some of those organizations who actually go into schools. There's also FFA as an organization where there are student organizations at the junior high and high school levels that are connected to universities. So there are various ways to try to get connected. As university representative, we're always happy to speak with teachers to talk about how we can create articulation agreements and programming in those areas. We have a few other questions in the chat. Melody says, I was the first African-American woman to graduate from the University of Washington with a BS in forest management and the first Black female forester in 10 USDA Forest Service. I was introduced to and developed my love of animals and nature by my mother, never introduced to STEM career in school. What role do parents play in this issue? What role do parents play?
I can speak on that a little bit.
Okay, Candice.
When we were doing research, as I said before, Evelyn, you actually alluded to the imagery that we have, right? And if you were to Google agriculture, environmental science, and look at images, you'll see non-people of color on rocks or climbing, standing by waterfalls, or you have this imagery that doesn't quite show what some people's reality is when it comes to their exposure. But what we have to be mindful of is almost everyone is exposed to agriculture, environmental science at some point in their life. And that's partly what we wanted to say in when we were doing research ourselves, is that all agriculture and environmental science, natural resources people don't look like those images. And a lot of times the exposure comes from a grandmother who had you help shell peas, or it came from an aunt who asked you to help can something, or it came from you visiting your grandparents who may have lived in the rural part of a state that you're from. I'm a North Carolina native, so I have family in very rural parts of the state, and my agriculture and environmental exposure really came from them. And it may not have necessarily been on a farm directly, because that's another generation behind me, but it did come from that exposure of being in those areas. And so I think a lot of times parents do play a big role in just doing little things at home, whether it's just, let's plant some mint, or let's plant some rosemary, or any of those small agricultural efforts expose the students, and that could be the spark for them.
Thank you, Candice. Anyone else? Okay, we have one more question in the chat. Lisa says, now that climate change impacts are so massive and visible, it can be hard even for youth to feel optimistic about their impacts. How do you help them and yourselves stay positive?
I struggle with this question all the time because I care so deeply about social justice work. And I'm like, how do we fix the whole world in one day? And it's not possible, right? So chunking out what you're able to do, an issue that you're passionate about, and then identifying what your talents are is a way that I focus myself, and I encourage it of other people. So if your talents deal with the arts, use the arts to address an issue that's that you're passionate about. If it's sciences, use scientific method to address an issue you're passionate about. So thinking about what problem can I tackle in my lifetime, and how can I galvanize others for this cause is something that I encourage. We have some curriculum in 4-H. One recent one is called the Ag Innovators Experience, and it talks about curbing your carbon footprint. We have programs like Exploration, Experience, Thrive Naturally. So we have all these curriculum that bring it down to age appropriateness for youth to be able to tackle an issue and understand the ripple effect of their work. And then if they get their friends on board with addressing this issue in their school, in their neighborhood, on their block, on their property, the ripple effect that their efforts will have. And that's kind of how we try to focus it down.
Yeah, I agree with that, because I always kind of start young folks where I kind of familiar with and get them to, I say, you know what, start growing food, because there's some things about the air you might take you a while to fix, and there's some things about the water it might take you a while to fix, but you can immediately start growing something that you can't even buy in the store. You can't even buy it in the store. You can grow something better and more healthier than what you can get in a store, which you would probably pay a lot of money for. So start there, and then that will kind of, set the fire as far as your creative processes and moving in different directions to really kind of solve some of these problems. But start very simple right there. Growing a tomato.
Okay. So since we're talking about inspiring the youth, I want to hear from each of you. What inspired you as a young person to pursue your career? And were you a member of any type of a youth organization, or did you have a mentor? What put you on your current path, if anything?
I can just start real quickly. I didn't get to agriculture until quite late in life. So if I got there as late as I did, and kind of have a good grasp of it now, I did have a mentor. I was fortunate. Like I said, I always point back to George Washington Carver. When I was looking around, and I worked in a group of people who none of them looked like me, I could look on one person and focus on that person and see what that person did and really get an understanding of what I needed to do. And that was George Washington Carver. So that was one of my main kind of folks I gravitated toward, and finding out what he did and how he did it. And, it meant everything for me.
Jay, you mentioned George Washington Carver a few times, and we actually have some educators in 4-H who feel the same as you do, and we actually have a George Washington Carver Day. Evelyn actually was able to come out to one of those events where hundreds of kids from Baltimore County Public Schools come down and cycle through different activities to learn about the science that George Washington Carver initiated and how it has long impacts on what we do today. So it's great to hear that name shared. We actually have a school in Baltimore named after him.
Okay.
But so I too did not come to agriculture until my adult life. I really have always been passionate about youth development and not focus on any one particular career that you'll push youth to, but expanding their options, like Candice mentioned, exposing them to anything that they have a spark or interest in is what I care about. So making sure that, and all the mentors that I had in my life did just that for me. They connected me with people, they introduced me to new things, and they never made me feel that anything was impossible, right? So giving that same energy to young people, encouraging them to chase after their dreams, and then helping them take down those barriers that might be in their way is what I aspire to do.
So I think my inspiration in science, generally speaking, was started in the 8th grade. There was a program, actually it was an after school program that I chose called Math Science Enrichment Network. And it was just a club that we had after school where we talked about science, we talked a bit about math, and part of the program at the end of the year was to join the same program at the high school level. And so we had this transition period where you could stay with it or move, to something different. And so I decided to stay with it because I enjoyed the conversation. But little did I know, once I joined it in high school, they actually took it to another level. We had a program called Saturday Academy. And basically we went to school from 9 to 12 every Saturday for probably about half of the school year. And we were exposed to science at all different levels, math at all different levels. So as a 9th grader, I may be taking algebra, but I could be exposed to algebra 2 or geometry in these Saturday academies. So, and then they also had another component that allowed us to be exposed to professions. So we were able to meet neuroscientists. We were able to meet dentists, people from all different professions, and they were all minorities. So I think that spark and that initial interest in science kind of what took me through the different wickets that I went through to get to environmental science.
Thank you. And I too am pleased to hear that the name of Dr. George Washington Carver is being invoked here, and so too do several of our audience members. So I'm going to read a question from Esther Mitchell, who asks the question, our history does not take into account that Black people have been among the leading scientists in agriculture and the environment. We talk about George Washington Carver, but what about other Black agriculturalists and environmentalists? Discussing the lost history will put another slant on Black agriculture other than the slave worker job. So I absolutely agree with that. Again, it's all about exposure and knowledge and exposing the youth to the great things that people of color have done in science and the environment. And for me, that was one of the things that kind of had me pivot towards an environmental career. I went to college, wanted to be an English and Spanish double major, but I was really undecided, and my academic advisor was a geographer, physical geographer who studied geology and earthquakes. And he put me in 2 classes, and I learned all about George Washington Carver and others who had done great work, and I was inspired by that. That was kind of the pivotal moment for me. So you're absolutely right. History is an important component of that because we really need to feel a sense of pride. Che?
Yeah, quickly, and that's good too. That's great. And hello to Esther. And like I said, I've been doing some research, in a book that I'm currently working on is the African origins of urban agriculture, Nile Valley civilizations. But it's interesting that these people who created the first true sustainable agriculture in the humankind, these Black people, I mean, there's some reasons. I mean, because of the environment, the Nile River was such a sustaining river. And plus they had a religion which honored men and women equally. They had gods and goddesses. And I think all of that played on their psyche as far as them really protecting the environment and doing the things they needed to do, and had an equitable kind of outlook as far as what was better for the whole universe and all the people because of that.
Thank
Yeah, I
you.
absolutely agree. I think we need to do more discussion, have more discussions, and focus more on history prior to enslavement, right? We tend to focus on life after that, life after colonization, and that leaves behind the roots of our ancestors that, you know, were deeply connected to this work. So I couldn't agree more. And I also think there's opportunity to talk about the land grant story, the HBCU land grant story, and HBCUs in general, and their space in this work. There's lots of history that's not discussed and shared. And there's lots of disparities that have happened between land grant systems in the agricultural fields over time as well, that can be discussed and should inform how we think about these fields today.
Another question from the audience. I am new to the entire environmental conservation arena. Listening to a seasoned environmental scientist and white environmental scientist is very different. Am I imagining this? If my observations are correct, it seems that the main difference has to do with the emphasis or lack thereof on care and relating to and with people. Your thoughts? So does anyone have any thoughts on that?
I can speak a little bit on that. So it's very interesting with that question, because yesterday's keynote speaker, Ms. Flowers, mentioned in doing environmental work, and her talk was more so about injustices that were happening in urban lands. But what she said the missing component is people's ability to talk to people, not come to them and say, this is what we're going to do, but asking them, what do you need for us to do to help you, to help your water situation be better, your sewage situation be better. And I think traditionally, even in environmental science classes that I've taken throughout my career, that is sort of the rhetoric that you hear. What we can do as scientists, what we can do for the people to make it better. But we have to stop sometimes and think, what do they want us to do to help make the situation better? And a really good example of that is a project that I worked on in an environmental justice community, where the residents basically said, there's something wrong, we smell something funny. They brought in the state did an assessment, brought in EPA started doing some additional assessment. Then they have this community meeting, and the residents are still saying, so what is the outcome? They still never got an answer. And so now you have all these entities talking, but they're not explaining things to the people. They're not talking to the people saying, okay, this is what's going on in your community, but how can we help you all resolve it, right? So the conversation is one way sometimes. And as environmental scientists, we have to remember to help not only the environment prevent injustices occurring and remedy those that have already occurred. The conversation has to go both ways. So I think when you're hearing professors talk about environmental science work, they also have to talk about how the injustice came about. And that includes the community that is being affected. And then kind of work your way backwards to say, okay, because this caused this negative effect to the community, how can we as scientists help them make it better so they can continue to live there?
Thank you. So we have another question in the chat from Renee. And Renee says, I'm looking to switch fields within environmental science. I would like to know if there are resources to find career paths focused on fighting racism with air and water quality. So what resources could she find to change her path?
That probably starts with the program. Looking at the departmental programs and what their focuses are, as a place to start. If you're
Absolutely.
from, is it science to non-science, or is it science to science? There's a
So
lot.
I would start by just reading articles. If you're interested in environmental sciences and environmental racism and environmental justice issues, start by becoming more knowledgeable of what some of those issues are, and that might help you to develop a focus area. Also, I would reach out to individuals such as myself and Dr. Nia Imani and Mr. Che and Dr. Duncan and ask questions. I'm sure there are many speakers who have insights and information on how you could go about switching your path. Remember, part of the purpose of this conference is to network and to get to know people. So I know my information is available on my bio. Shoot me a message. We're happy to put you in contact with information and resources. But if you're a student, I would suggest speaking with an academic advisor or going to a career center. If you're a high school student, maybe speak with your teacher or a counselor. Definitely look at resources online, such as the Manners website. They have a lot of information about environmental careers. Other organizations, you could even look at some government agencies that talk about career paths, the Environmental Protection Agency, even the NAACP, they have information on environmental justice issues, statistics, things of that nature. So start by educating yourself and networking with individuals who can help you find that path.
Evelyn, can I add, don't be afraid to ask departments and programs, if you're looking to switch educationally, what their stance is on justice in their courses. I think it does two things. It allows you to see if their programs are rooted through that justice lens, and it also lets the departments know that there's interest in community for that. So if it's lacking, that might be an area where they can grow. So I think, and then, seeking courses outside of any one college can help. So, with me as an example, I was interested in urban development, but I also had a passion for youth development. So I took courses in multiple colleges for that reason. So you can always blend those things together.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
So there is another question we have from the audience, but it's connected to our next question. So I'm going to ask the question and then follow up in the chat. So this next question is, what advice do you have for young people who want to get involved in advocacy, activism in the areas of the environment and agriculture, so that they can start solving or addressing some of the world's grand challenges, feeding a growing population, addressing environmental degradation, being an advocate for communities that are experiencing environmental racism? What can young people do now to begin to prepare? So what can they do now to prepare?
I think you mentioned it some with the last question, Evelyn, is start reading, start learning, start absorbing information, because it will take critical thinking to be able to tackle any of those issues that you just shared. So understanding what issues exist in your community, understand what issues exist in the world around you, and then dive deeper, right? So, I use the example often when it comes to food insecurity that we tend to just say, well, what's the Band-Aid we can put on it? Let's figure out how we can collect canned goods and distribute them, right? Versus understanding, why do food deserts exist and what type of people live in food deserts? Why, it's not coincidental that you'll see Black and brown and folks in lower income communities residing in food deserts. And it's not just urban communities, it's rural communities as well. And it's not just overseas, it's in our state and in our country. So exploring those things, allowing critical thinking, asking, encouraging them to ask questions and to read literature beyond just dominant identity derived literature, right? Understanding the voices and perspectives from the marginalized communities is so critical in this work, and then begin making those networks so they have the tools that they need to advocate. If it's through policy, if it's through art, if it's through social media campaigns, there's so many different forms of advocacy, and understanding what those avenues are and how to be successful through those are important. For those interested in curriculum, I mentioned the True Leaders in Justice curriculum that we have through 4-H that's going to be published this spring. So if folks are interested in seeing some of those examples, certainly reach out to me and I'll be happy to share.
Yeah, I think it would be, it will be a challenge in some cases because those folks, Black and brown folks looking out to join these organizations, I mean, you can either go two ways. You can join an organization where most of the people look like you, or sometimes when you go to another organization where most of the people don't look like you, I mean, your voice might be minimalized. So you have to be careful of that. You have to be careful not to get complacent and fall into that pattern and speak up and demand that your questions and your thoughts are valued. So you have to be very careful, but there are different avenues you can go and you can be successful in both of those, but there are some challenges.
I would say just three things. The first, Nia already mentioned, and that's identifying an area that may be having some environmental justice issues. And so identify that area. And the second thing I would suggest, find it and identify it. And the second thing I would suggest is attend a community meeting. Go and sit and be an observer in a community meeting where they are discussing an environmental justice issue. You will gain so much knowledge as to who the parties are that are making the decisions, who is being affected, and how you can help in those meetings. And the third is possibly attend a council meeting where these issues are sometimes brought up because some laws or legislative acts are being decided upon locally in those meetings as well, or discussed. So you don't necessarily have to act yet, but just make up, like Nia said, do some research, go to a few meetings, sit and listen, and see where you could be of service.
And can I add, Shay mentioned something that's really important. We don't want to do more harm than good by encouraging youth to go into spaces where they're not welcomed or feel no sense of belonging, right? Because that can be so detrimental to their well-being and to the choices they make from then on out. So this notion of agency or efficacy, the belief that they matter and that they belong and that they can make a difference is so important. So for those of us who are youth development educators or teachers or mentors or volunteers, it's so important for us to nurture young people in that way, to connect them with people that care about them, to build their Rolodex, if you will, of the who you knows that they have so that they can bring about change, so that they feel like they deserve to be in the space when they go to that community meeting, like Candice mentioned, that they deserve to be there, that they have a voice and they should use it. And that they might have some roadblocks along the way, but they know they can reach out to Candice. They know they can reach out to Nia or Shay or Evelyn when they run against those roadblocks, and we're there to have their back and support them. That's so critical. And we all have the ability to do that and to elevate a youth agency in that way.
Thank you. So we have more questions. How can we curb the trend of students leaving the environmental field after high school and college? Some students graduate with multiple STEM-related internships and or extracurricular activities, but have difficulty finding employment or grants to start their own businesses. There are actually several issues embedded within that one question, but does anyone want to take a stab at one or more parts of that question?
Come to Extension. So that's not the start your business side, but as far as careers, many organizations like Extension and like land grant universities struggle with finding candidates to diversify our faculty and staff base, right? There's so many reasons for that, but we have to do a better job letting you know we want you. And then applicants and graduates need to know that this is a space where they can thrive. So, Extension is certainly a place, 4-H is certainly a place where we are looking to have folks who represent the demographics of our community. So look for those types of organizations. And if you don't see folks that look like you, ask the question why. We have to make that change. And if one person doesn't start it off, then we'll be in this cycle for too long.
So I'll just say, part of a program that I am a part of, we've added a component where the students, college students, juniors and seniors, have the ability to go to various agencies to see what they can do with a geoscience career or environmental science career. Sometimes we lose them in them not being able to physically see, I take these classes, I do these internships. What does my day-to-day work or career possibly look like? And so part of that program was to take the students to some of these agencies so they can see, if I have a degree in hydrology or geoscience or environmental science or geology, this is the type of work that I may be able to do at these different agencies. So we can connect the coursework, the internships to the career.
Yeah, I think that students have to be able to see it in order to be it. And so I think this concept of providing experiential hands-on learning activities where students can not only experience what it would be like, but they see people that look like them, that reflect them in those career fields is very crucial. It's crucial at the high school level. We have another program where we bring students on campus for 3 weeks, Ag Discovery. They experience all of our research with animals and plants and the environment. And then we introduce them to scientists who work for a government agency, USDA, to help them visualize what would they have to do academically to prepare, and then what would their day-to-day career look like. And we do the same thing with college students in terms of research in the environment and agriculture, pairing them with faculty to actually do hands-on activities. So I think the experiential component, high school, middle school, is very important, and also helping them to network with people that look like them so that they could see that they could actually engage, they could pursue that career and be a part of that. So I've just gotten the warning that we have 5 minutes left, which means we probably have about 2 minutes left now. So I'm going to go to our last question. What problem do you, as a panel, what do you guys think we are overlooking right now for the next generation? What are we seeing, or where are we seeing that we might need to reinvest some interest and energy for young people? Any ideas on that?
Well, I think I would start by just kind of reiterating something that we've said before, and that's exposing them and letting them know that these careers and jobs exist. Right now, the literature is telling us that baby boomers will be retiring, that largest group will be retiring. And I believe Gen Z will be the next large group, if I'm correct, if I have the letters right, will be the next large group moving into the workforce. But those who are going into STEM careers, especially in geoscience careers, environmental science, agriculture, are the smallest percentage amongst Black and Brown people. So one, we have to convince them, if you want to solve the climate change issue, work on environmental issues, work on food security issues, you have to get into these jobs and positions that will be vacant in the future. And that's one way to kind of hopefully inspire and say, hey, if we want to make this world better for us and the 7 generations after us, as I spoke about yesterday, you have to, we have to get in these fields and make the work meaningful and impactful for our future.
Great answer, thank you.
And I don't think, we've overlooked this, but for me, I just remember when I worked at USDA, just, trying to abolish some of the systemic racism and things like that that are in these organizations. You got to get rid of that, and got to, make people feel comfortable, nurture them while they're there, and they need to be protected. So unless that's done, it's going to be very difficult.
Absolutely, the culture is important, the environment that we provide. So
Exactly.
I want to thank my panelists, Dr. Imani Fields, Dr. Candice Duncan, and Mr. Axum for joining us today. Thank you so much. And if you have questions or we didn't answer your question in the chat, please do follow up with us for the remainder of the conference. Thank you so much and have a great day.
Go Terps.